One of the most famous stories from the Kentucky frontier is the capture of Daniel Boone and the 27 salt boilers by the Shawnees, and Boone's escape, followed by the attack on Boonesboro. But Boone wasn't the only one to escape, nor was he the first. Most of the prisoners found themselves adopted by Shawnee families who lost loved ones. Others were taken to Detroit and ransomed off to the British. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton offered a good price for Daniel Boone, but Chief Blackfish refused. He was proud of his newly adopted son. By reputation, Boone stood out among the captives. He was a great hunter and was seen as a great chief of the Long Knives. But there was another captive that stood out for totally different reasons. His name was Andrew Johnson, no relation to the 17th president. He was small in stature and not very intimidating, but this only made him more intriguing to the Shawnees, who couldn't tell if he was a teenage boy or just a small man. Andy Johnson was a special case. To his Indian hosts, he seemed a bit slow. Boone suggested that Johnson might be afflicted with a form of madness, but again, that only added to his character. The Shawnee believed that those who were touched by madness were blessed, and if they were treated well, their blessings would spread to whomever showed them kindness. After his adoption ritual, Andy Johnson became Pecula, which means little duck, or little shuts his eyes. He was taken in by an old Shawnee warrior who already had a few kids of his own. Before long, he became popular as the village idiot. When Pecula tagged along for some target shooting, it appeared he had never held a rifle before in his life. The Shawnees must have thought, how in the world did this fool find himself in the company of Daniel Boone and other fine woodsmen? The sound of gunfire made him jump, and he flinched at the sight of every flash from the powder pan. The warriors hung targets on some of the trees, and when it was Pecula's turn, not only did he miss the targets, but also the trees holding them. Next, his host tested his sense of direction. When his Shawnee brothers asked, "Hey Pecula, which way to Kentuck?" he would stop and think hard about it, looking around trying to figure out which way was which. Then he'd raise his finger and point north. The warriors fell to the ground laughing so hard they could hardly catch their breath. Poor Pecula had the mind of a child, they thought. Everything he was asked to do he did with great incompetence. While this was great entertainment for the Shawnees, it was becoming a hindrance for his adopted family. Pecula and his adopted brother got into a fight, and he gave him a good beating. His Shawnee father came home from a raid and scolded Pecula, threatening to sell him off if he didn't straighten up. The town was preparing for a great dance, and Pecula was looking to participate, but his father essentially told him he was grounded. Instead of dancing, he was instructed to stay home with the children, while the other grown-ups got to have their fun. Prior to this, Pecula enjoyed a decent amount of freedom with little supervision, unlike the other white adoptees who were watched closely. The Shawnees figured he was too dumb to make it far, so they didn't pay much attention to him. On the night of the great dance, Pecula decided he was going to disobey his father and attend anyway. When he arrived, his father confronted him and asked him what he was doing. Pecula said he really just wanted to dance. His father told him he could have his dance, but afterwards he was to go straight home and not come back. Pecula agreed and began to dance around the fire. On the morning after, Andy Johnson, known to the Shawnee as Pecula, had vanished. His Shawnee father's tomahawk, knife, trusty rifle, a blanket, a coat, and some powder and lead vanished along with him. The Shawnee sent out a search party, but he was nowhere to be found. The initial reaction to Pecula's escape wasn't anger or feelings of betrayal. It was concern, followed by grief. The Shawnee were genuinely worried sick about poor Pecula. They knew there was no way that dummy could survive out there in the wild, but no fool deserved to die from starvation. The warriors thought maybe they teased him too much. There wasn't any malice behind their teasing, but perhaps Pecula didn't see it that way. His Shawnee father blamed himself and mourned his newly adopted white son. He thought maybe he was too hard on Pecula and caused him to run away. The Shawnees asked Daniel Boone if he thought Pecula knew the way to Kentuck. Boone shrugged and said, "I don't know." Out in the wild, Andy Johnson traveled through the creeks to minimize the amount of tracks left behind. The facade of the village idiot had dissolved. As it turns out, Johnson was no dummy. He was quite cozy in the presence of a long rifle, and he certainly knew the way to Kentucky. In May of 1778, Johnson made it to Boonesboro, and brought back the first word on the missing 27 salt boilers, and invaluable information on the whereabouts of the Shawnee, their trails, camps, and strongholds, which were a mystery for decades. He also reported on Daniel Boone's apparent treachery. He claimed Boone swore an oath to British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton in Detroit, which was true, but Johnson failed to recognize that Boone, like him, was also playing a part to deceive the natives. His report, along with those from other escapees, would lead to Boone's eventual court-martial. To them, Boone seemed a little too comfortable with the Shawnee hosts. A couple weeks after his return, Johnson formed a small raiding party destined for the Ohio country. They left Harrodsburg painted and dressed like Shawnees and crossed the Ohio River on rafts, then followed the Little Miami Trail north towards a cluster of towns. Since they were just a small party of men, they stuck to scouting out smaller camps in the territory. On the trail, they heard the sound of tingling bells and followed the noise. What they found were 7 horses, which they promptly stole and hid them off the trail. The Shawnees were camped nearby. Johnson decided to ambush them using typical Shawnee tactics. He and his small party of raiders lied in wait until sometime during the night when the camp dogs picked up their scent and started barking. They fired upon the Shawnees and fired again. Chief Blackfish happened to be present at this camp and thought they were being shot at by their own brothers, so he called out, "Hey, we're Shawnee! We're Shawnee!" The raiders kept shooting, and the Shawnee scattered. Johnson and the others rode back to Kentucky with 7 horses. On the way back, a Shawnee scout spotted the horses and recognized Pecula among them. Blackfish approached Boone after he returned to Chillicothe, and asked him if he knew anyone who would be bold enough to cross the Ohio and steal horses from the Shawnee. Boone reckoned it could be Pecula. Blackfish scoffed at the notion. Pecula was a fool, he said. He could never reach Kentucky. He was no fool, Boone replied, but a man of good sense and a fine woodsman. Why didn't you tell me this before? Blackfish inquired. You never asked, said Boone, and you all seemed contented on using him for a laughingstock. The Shawnee scout who spotted Pecula returned and told Boone that while Pecula was a little man, he was a great rogue. The Shawnees couldn't help but be impressed with Johnson's duplicity. Boone would later lead his own raids after his escape, in hopes of proving his loyalty to the settlers at Boonesboro. Andy Johnson's horse-stealing expedition may not sound like much, but it was a turning point. For years, the Shawnee raiders would strike, then vanish across the Ohio, with little concern for counterattack. Now that the locations of their strongholds had been revealed, those days were now over. Kentucky settlers were now raiding the natives instead of reverse. Johnson and the other escapees' intel would eventually travel to George Rogers Clark, and come in handy during his campaigns in Ohio. Blackfish realized bringing home 27 prisoners brought doom on the Shawnee. He could no longer delay the attack on Boonesboro. Johnson did his part in the 10-day siege at Boonesboro. He was present at Daniel Boone's trial and gave his testimony. Boone was acquitted and later promoted to major. Though it ended in his favor, the whole ordeal was humiliating for him and he never talked about it. Andy Johnson would later become a prosperous farmer in Scott County, Kentucky. He died on his 75th birthday on January 25th, 1820. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching Frontier Lore, and take care.